right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Anderson House here in Washington, D.C. My name is Andrew Allen and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, developing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done all of this work from right here at its headquarters, Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark that was completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson. Today's Lunch Bite features Paul Newman discussing the diplomatic uniform commissioned by Lars Anderson for his appointment as the American ambassador to Belgium in 1911, and that is also currently featured in our current exhibition, Affairs of State, 118 Years of Diplomacy and Entertaining at Anderson House. Paul Newman is the Institute's Museum Collections and Operations Manager, having joined the professional staff here at Anderson House in November of 2021. Prior to joining our staff, he was on the curatorial staff at the Regimental Museum of the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards at Edinburgh Castle in Scotland, as well as on the interpretive staff of the United States Capitol here in Washington, D.C. Paul has a keen interest and expertise in British and American weapons, uniforms, and military artifacts. But today he's going to shift gears a bit to channel this expertise from the military world to the diplomatic world to discuss an important piece from our museum collections. Now, before I hand the lectern over to Paul, I would be remiss if I didn't cover the necessary housekeeping items for those of you joining us on Zoom today. Following the presentation, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions for Paul at any point during the presentation using the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming my colleague, Paul Newman.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for that introduction. I hope everyone knows how appropriate it is that he's wearing his blue suit and I've got my red sweater, or dare I say jumper, on. Just think about those colors. Well, I am just simply delighted to be speaking to you all today regarding this wonderful diplomatic uniform of Larz Anderson's, and it's simply one of the most striking elements of the Society's textile collection here. Before we investigate the items in question, I am going to take a step back to talk about where the idea of diplomatic dress in the Western European context originated. Other cultures of diplomatic dress were and are worn. However, the uniform I am focusing on today came from the tradition originating in Western Europe. Diplomatic dress is the costume worn by foreign and civil service staff, such as a charge d'affaires and ambassadors, as well as lower ranking individuals. Western European diplomatic dress. Diplomatic dress has developed from court dress, where status was important to show one's position and wealth. This was a world littered with protocol, ensuring all customs and respects were shown to one's peers and those in higher stations, especially when it comes to national leaders and monarchs. These diplomats, as they still are in effect an extension of one's own government. Western European diplomatic dress, or court dress, stems from the 18th century, in particular the court fashion of France's ancien regime. Here we have two examples of French court suits. They consist of a richly embroidered tailcoat, waistcoat, breeches, and they would be worn with stockings and buckled shoes. By the First French Empire of Napoleon Bonaparte, court dress hierarchy becomes firmly established as a way to order individuals, just as it was done in the Napoleonic military. These uniforms informed others of the position of the wearer in that society. Simply put, the more ornate and higher quality the garment, the more important the wearer and their position. In this illustration from a 1908 British book on men's court dress, the typical form of diplomatic dress shown is that was becoming the norm by the mid to late 19th century, continuing through the 20th century and up to today. This particular illustration highlights two forms of court dress: full dress on the left, and on the right, half dress, or the so-called levee dress. Full dress being the most opulent and traditional, reserved for occasions such as a diplomat's presentation to a monarch. Levee dress is the more subdued in appearance. Rather than breeches and shoes, trousers and boots are worn. The occasion for this wearing of garments would be such as a reception or a levee, hence the name. Pictured in 1929, this is the Canadian legation to Tokyo, Japan. Here we have a range of dress worn, providing a great example of how diplomatic rank is shown by the costume. Now, I do not know the men's positions, but the dress we can see here tells us part of this story. And remember, that was the whole point of this dress. The two extremes are the gentleman in morning suit, who's on the far left as you're looking at the screen. He's a morning suit with top hat. And then second from the right is the gentleman that was the head of the legation, wearing very much full dress, diplomatic uniform, much in the same vein as Lars's own costume upstairs. Upstairs as in here in the physical house. And then the other two remaining men are wearing a lesser form of diplomatic uniform, again, showing that they are of reasonable status, because the gentleman in morning suit is probably an aide, maybe a batman, so a personal aide to maybe the head of legation. I do have their names, but with that, I just haven't got their exact positions, except for the head of legation. So yes, they're wearing a more demure version of the full dress, so minus the full embroidery on the front of the coat. Though I am examining Western diplomatic dress, this was not limited to the nations of the West. Here is a diplomatic ensemble from Japan, dating to the period of the Second World War. Following the restoration of the Meiji dynasty in 1868, Japan industrialized and looked to Europe and North America for inspiration in a range of areas. Western dress was adopted, which included diplomatic costume. The coat here, especially seen from behind, features goldwork design in the form of a kiri or paulownia flower. This is the symbol to this day of the Japanese government. Now we're going to shift to diplomatic dress as it relates to the United States, and I've got a couple of examples. Here we have a coatee and trousers owned by a Charles Haddock. He was the US chargé d'affaires to Portugal in the early 1850s. And on the left there, we have the dress uniform worn by a John White from the early 20th century, while he was second secretary to the US mission in Petrograd, otherwise known as St. Petersburg in Russia. And this is the 19-teens, specifically 15 to 16. A bicorn, much the same in appearance and style and structure as the chapeau bras that we're going to be looking at and talking about more of Larz Anderson's, and a diplomatic sword, again, very much in keeping with the design we'll focus on more later. Now, the American example is particularly interesting when it comes to diplomatic costume, because after all, is peacocking appropriate for a republic? From the founding of the United States in 1776 to the 20th century, the argument had raged between those that wanted American foreign service personnel to dress in a manner in keeping with their European peers, or those wanting a more subtle approach in keeping with a republic and the American citizen. So there's these two main camps of thought. On one hand, those in favor of a grander fashion sense for the diplomats include the likes of James Monroe and to an extent Andrew Jackson. Referring firstly to James Monroe, and to give a bit of context before I get to Monroe, in the intervening period from America's Revolutionary War and the presidency of James Madison, US diplomats during this period very much emulated their European peers and could design their own uniforms. In a letter dated April 23rd, 1813, to a James Bayard, then Secretary of State James Monroe states his wish to prescribe a uniform for our ministers abroad, which, while it will give a national character and make a good appearance, will comport with our system of economy. i.e. they want it to look nice, but not be too expensive. Remember, it's a new country. They are at this very moment fighting the War of 1812 against the British, and they haven't got their trade to the extent that they're wanting it to get to, partly because of the war with British, the British Empire in France, and then in turn Britain against the United States. On 6th of November 1817, there was a directive from the State Department establishing a uniform for American diplomats consisting of an embroidered blue jacket lined with white silk, a cape, white breeches, gold knee buckles, white silk stockings, and a three-cornered chapeau bras. And a chapeau bras I'll come back to, but just to mention it right now to give context, chapeau is French for hat, bras is French for arm, so essentially you have an arm hat. Usually the case being that they wouldn't wear them on the head. It's designed to be carried by under the arm or with your hand, and it harks back to the 18th century where wigs got to such a large extent, especially in the French court, that the hats that were deemed appropriate for gentlemanly wear could no longer fit on one's head. That's where that's coming from. But as you see, this example that is being mandated at this point during Madison's administration is very much in keeping with what the Europeans are doing. Ooh. Fast forwarding to Andrew Jackson's administration of 1829 to 1837, he follows a similar line to James Monroe, this idea of having a uniform that is attractive yet cost-effective, though he actually wanted a more subtle design, and they end up going to a kind of black and white color scheme. But again, it's a tailcoat, waistcoat, breeches, stockings, and buckled shoes. So still in keeping with what the European trends, essentially, again, I should say Western European styles there. By the 1850s, the arguments against this foppery, dare I say, or extravagant dress are becoming louder. There's an 1853 circular that simply states, as far as practicable, without impairing his usefulness to his country, his appearance at court, and by his, they're talking about American ministers, ambassadors, and so on, should be the simple dress of an American citizen. Further on in the circular, Benjamin Franklin is mentioned by name. And throughout this American story of the arguments for and against dress uniforms for American foreign service figures and civil service figures, Benjamin Franklin is this figure that represents the ideal of a simpler time, a simpler uniform, and more in keeping with the idea of a republic, going away from a monarchy and an aristocracy. And that brings us to the camp of figures that want the subdued appearance. So there is Benjamin Franklin, the top left of the three individuals there, with his famous coonskin cap there, his raccoon skin cap that was trying to, and very much he's not doing this on accident. He's from Massachusetts originally, of course, spends a lot of his time in Philadelphia. He's very much a learned gentleman, and he's styling himself in a way to hark back to the frontiersmen of this new United States. And this is especially endearing, as Franklin knows, to the courts of France and elsewhere in Europe. Even though Franklin becomes this name synonymous with this this more simplistic style, he was known, at least on one occasion, to wear full dress diplomatic uniform at French court. And interestingly, in the White House hangs a painting of Franklin wearing such a uniform, though it was commissioned by a British individual in kind of a tribute to Franklin's learnedness. And so they gave him certain trappings of being a learned gentleman of the European style. Anyway, Franklin is the big name when it comes to this argument, at least for the camp that is in favor of a more Republican style. By the 1860s, Charles Sumner, top right there, of caning infamy. That's a story for another day. He was on the receiving end, I should say, to that. He didn't do the caning. One of the great American abolitionists. He was very much against the idea of a fancy uniform for the American diplomats. and he's in favor of Congress passing a resolution against all of this. And Congress in 1867 passes a joint resolution exactly going along with that thought. It states it's prohibiting them, i.e. the ministers and officers of the diplomatic service, from wearing any uniform or official costume not previously authorized by Congress. However, by the early 20th century, though it is not clear whether the rules were changed, I don't believe so, some US foreign representatives are notably in several of those serving in countries where they have a monarchy and a court where such clothing would be appropriate, are starting to wear and commission their own uniforms again, which will bring us to Larz Anderson. Finally, before I leave this discussion of the two camps, what seems to be the last word in this discussion is left to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, hence his picture at the bottom there. In 1937, interestingly, just after Larz Anderson had passed away, he issued an executive order that foreign service personnel must not wear a uniform unless it is approved by Congress. Congress has yet to do so. So let's delve into this fabulous uniform of Larz Anderson. The photograph here of Lars, and we'll see a fuller extent to this image in a moment, is Lars in Brussels in his residence when he was the US minister there. This is 1911 to 1912. He's wearing his uniform in his left hand. Let's see, there we go. In his left hand, he's holding a pair of leather gloves, his chapeau bras, which was very much, that's what it was for. On his left side, he's got suspended from a belt his diplomatic sword. He's wearing trousers over Wellington riding boots, leather pattern boots, which would have had box spurs. And the outside seam of both legs of the trousers have a gold lace down them. The painting on the right, which is upstairs in the Olmsted Gallery, which you can see if you are visiting the rest of the house today, or you come and see us in the future, for those of you on Zoom, is by DeWitt Lockman. It's from 1914, and it pictures Lars in fabulous color, wearing his diplomatic uniform as well as his coat, which we'll talk about a bit later. And he is extensively decorated in his honors, decorations, and medals from mostly foreign governments, including Japan, Belgium, Italy, and top of them all is his Society of the Cincinnati insignia that he's wearing from a neck ribbon at the top there. Now let's talk about the uniform in particular. So here we have the front and the back of the full uniform. It consists of a tailcoat of dark blue cloth, so that's wool. It's single-breasted with a standing collar and gauntlet cuffs. The fastening is with hook and eye enclosures. There are 9 gilt buttons up the front, 2 at the waist behind, and 2 at the end of the tails. Each button features the Great Seal of the United States. Interestingly, Lars provided those to his tailor, Davies Son, which they noted in their ledger entry for this whole commission order from Lars Anderson. And of course, the coat is richly adorned with gold work. Goldwork embroidery utilizes metallic thread to create lavish designs, in our case, of a foliate motif, in keeping with other uniforms of the period, but especially inspired by British dress uniforms of the civil and military spheres. This goldwork, plus the many sequins included within them, catches the light wonderfully. And for any of you that will be joining me upstairs later, I'll show you exactly what that looks like when we look at the uniform upstairs. And then lastly, the coat interior is lined with white silk. The coat such as this could be worn at court with breeches, silk stockings, and patent leather buckled shoes, a chapeau bras, and sword. If breeches weren't worn, trousers would be worn, and that's how we've dressed our Lars for this exhibit. The riding trousers that accompany the coat are made of a blue whipcord and feature that single stripe of gold braid down the outside seams. The trousers have the option to be worn with cloth stirrups, which allows them to be secured tightly underneath the Wellington boots. Thus, you get a very much cavalry gentleman's style silhouette. If you ever see British cavalrymen today, they still do that. Anyway, and then his box spurs, which we do actually have in the collection. They're silver. They're quite fun. Here's a better look at the gold work on the rear of the coat, as well as one of those fabulous gilt buttons with the Great Seal of the United States, which is really just fabulous. Incidentally, we do know for certain that Lars did order a set of breeches, but they no longer remain in the collection. We don't actually know whether they were put into the collection originally when the society took over. We don't know quite the story of that. But thanks to the work of a wonderful researcher, colleague of mine in London, who researched the City of Westminster archives to find Davies and Sons customer ledgers, which still survive in these archives. We have the order that Lars undertook on the 27th of September 1911, which lists out exactly what he was ordering and what it all cost, which I'll come back to that cost element a little bit later on. And so here is actually the tailor's label from Davies and Sons sewn into the back of the collar of the coat. There's also one in his trousers. There's one in his other coat, and which I'll talk about a little bit later on as well, and his greatcoat. So it's lovely because no offense to my American colleagues, but British are very good at telling you exactly what you need to know about historic things. If anyone's a fan of silver, you know what I mean. As my colleague Emily Parson knows, we're very good at naming everything. So thankfully, the British tailoring craft does that, and it told us everything we needed to know. It's got his order number, which you can then look up in the ledgers, but also it has his name. Yeah, it's just fabulous. And that what we do this for is this provenance, the magic of the history of the pieces. And so when you can come face to face with that in such a straightforward way, it's rather fun. A little bit more regarding the uniform and Lars himself. Now, as fabulous as this is, we do not believe that Lars ever wore his uniform for public function, which would have been frowned upon by the American government at the time. And in fact, he recorded himself in his journals that he would wear his US Army uniform from his Army days during the Spanish-American War of 1898. He would wear that on the occasions that he would be meeting Belgian members of the Belgian royal family, including the King and Queen, so King Albert, for example. That said, from examining the uniform in person, there is evidence of wear and tear in the garments. And actually in the trousers, we can see that they were later taken in. So it is entirely possible he wore this uniform in Brussels for private functions. He may have wore it here at Anderson House or at their main home in Brookline, Massachusetts, known as Weld, W-E-L-D. Lars also commissioned a second levee coat, though far from the convention of having a levee coat that's much more toned down. Lars Anderson had one that was almost as richly adorned with gold work. The only difference is there's slightly less gold work on the rear, on the tails. Other than that, you wouldn't really know. So it's quite different to what we tend to expect from such items. So Davies and Son, the makers, the great tailors of this set of garments, they were established in 1803. They operated out of number 19 Hanover Street, London, from the following year, 1804, through to 1979. And that it was during that tenure that Lars would have visited them, had his measurements taken. I don't think the building's still standing. Sadly, they moved just around 79. They moved to Savile Row, the one of the most famous streets for tailoring. And they now occupy number 38 Savile Row, and that's their store as of Thanksgiving, because we went past it. I'm pointing to a lot of the family are here today. And yeah, so it's if you're ever interested more in tailoring, Davies and Son have a fabulous website that delves into their story a little bit more. It's one of the longest running tailors on the row that haven't been bought out, because some of them bought out each other and things like that. So Davies and Son is still going strong, really wonderful tradition. Quite fun is that the royal warrants that they've obtained over the years, the likes of the British King George V, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, various Spanish and Norwegian kings, and 2 US presidents, though I've yet to find out which ones. But they do have a claim to that. And they still have the royal warrant to this day. The British royal family, that is. To continue the ensemble, so we have there on the left, as you're looking at it, the fabulous greatcoat of Lars Anderson with this wonderful red silk lining that you can just see peeking out from behind the tails there. Just rather lovely. If you ever see Changing the Guard outside Buckingham Palace, that's the kind of style that the gentlemen are wearing in the winter. We have that fabulous chapeau bras there on the top right. So again, chapeau meaning hat, bra meaning arm hat. That's what it means. You carried it around with you. Incidentally, if you're wondering where he kept things, I did wonder if maybe he kept things in his hat, but he did have a breast pocket on the inside of his left of his coat. So he did have that for storage, but not a lot. He had no trouser pockets, nothing like that. Oh, and then he would have worn, I hadn't mentioned it, he would have worn braces or suspenders with these trousers. They're very much high-waisted, as would be the style. And if you do go see his uniform, he's rather tall. He's a rather tall individual, which we did not expect until we put the uniform together. We all thought he was much more 5'7", 5'8", kind of realm, but he's looking a bit more like 6 foot. The hat, the chapeau bras, it's a beaver pelt. The majority of it is beaver pelt. It has watered silk, which are those ribbons there. It has braid, tricolor cockade, and then fore and aft over the crown, that's ostrich feathers. And then we have at the bottom right, we don't have his boots. We have none of the shoes actually that belong to either he or his wife, Isabel. But these are Wellington boots of the period, very much in keeping with what Lars would have owned. And again, he's got this pair have the spurs, and they're box spurs, and they actually just insert into the rear. There's a little compartment that they have a little latch that they kind of hook in, attach into very cleverly. And again, we do have the spurs in the collection, which are quite fun, but not boots. The sword, so diplomatic sword here that Lars has and is very much attached to the uniform, upstairs on display. The sword has a brass hilt, and I'll do a bit of flicking back and forth. Apologies, Andrew, a little bit just to give you a close up there. So it has a brass hilt, it has ivory grips, a large guard featuring the American eagle there, a sword knot made with a tassel of gold bullion. The blade features foliar etched designs. It has a brass mounted leather scabbard accompanying it. Now, these diplomatic swords very much, there are many examples all over the place, and to a large degree, they look the same. There's slight differences with material and designs, but it was very much a standard pattern. Now, this was retailed by Davies & Son. So when Lars went along to Davies & Son, he was able to buy everything in one go, except for his shoes. He would have bought them elsewhere, but in the same area, London, very conveniently. So Davies & Son, the marking to them is on the sword. They wouldn't have manufactured the piece. They would have bought it from somewhere else, a sword cutler, or maybe several, to have that all put together for them. In addition to these items in the collection and the breeches and the boots that I mentioned that aren't in the collection any longer, also in that entry in the catalogue of Davies & Son, we know he ordered a japanned airtight uniform case. So basically it's a tin case that would have had a lacquer on it to mimic Japanese decorative boxes of the 19th and earlier centuries. Very much in keeping with what all the British army officers and other officers from other nations were buying to keep their own uniforms in. The idea to keep moths at bay, keep them out of your wool uniform, and make it convenient for you. He also ordered some kind of other packing case, presumably maybe for his boots. Not quite sure on the detail there. And then he would have had his pair of white leather gloves, which was seen in that photograph. Now, the best thing with that ledger entry from Davies and Son is we know the costs of everything. It's all itemized. As a total, though, for all of the pieces he acquired from Davies and Son, it cost him the sum of £268 in 1911. Now, what rather wonderfully, that I found a transcript of a 1914, so 3 years later, a British parliamentary discussion where they were discussing the average working man's wages for that year. And I found a steam train driver, certainly on the higher end, was earning about 50 shillings a week. Now a shilling, 20 shillings make a British pound, or they did before the 1970s. And so at that rate, it would take a steam train driver, and mind you, a steam train driver is a very, well, it's a desirable career for life, very skilled individual, powering one of the most important vehicles in any kind of Western society at the time, very complicated, costly machine. A steam train driver in 1914, it would take him 2 years and 2 weeks to earn £268. And of course, that's not spending money on anything else, but to be able to commission such a uniform as we see with Lars Anderson. So to bring us to today and diplomatic full dress. So diplomatic uniform continues to be worn today, though not in the United States. Several nations around the world still have their foreign service and civil service individuals wearing such uniform. To take the UK as an initial example, here we have former ambassador, I couldn't write her name down, how dreadful, isn't it? Sally Axworthy in about 2015, when she was made British ambassador to the Holy See, i.e. in the Vatican, and she's wearing much the same diplomatic uniform as we've been seeing, though turned down compared to Lars's uniform and some others. But diplomatic sword she's wearing, she's carrying her chapeau bras, she has ornate gold work on the cuffs and the collar. And then the example standing next to Azita Raji, who was the US ambassador to Sweden in the 20-teens. We've got a Swedish individual that could not find his name in the caption, sadly, but he's wearing almost an identical uniform to Lars Anderson, and that's about 8 years ago. So yes, some things have changed, other things have not changed. And it's just quite a fun comparison. But thank you very much for your attention, folks. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm happy to take any questions from those of you in person, and then afterwards we'll see if there's any questions from those of you on Zoom. Yes, one question just here. Yes. Oh, so a levee coat. What is a levee coat? So just to explain it a little bit more, a levee is another term for a reception. Guilty of giving you more on the British context, but on the British context, you'd have it where a king or queen would have a levee. Various military officers, they'd come and get presented to the monarch, and they would call that a levee. So it's not as formal as a full-blown sort of ceremonial occasion, but still you have to be pretty smart in your appearance, and you can wear the more toned down version of your uniform, and you'd be wearing trousers instead of breeches, and buckled shoes and stockings. Levee, interestingly, is where we get the word lever or lever from. It's the idea of it's coming from the French of to rise. Anyway, I think it's because the idea that you maybe rose and were presented to the monarch. More etymology work to be done on that. Yes, any good question though? Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Very excellent question. So with the gold work that we've been looking at, would that have been done at the tailors, or would that be maybe sent out for other specialists? I believe it would be done on site by the tailors, Davies and Son. That would all be done by hand. Whereas with the rest of the garment, I don't know for sure. But that could have been machine stitched, though some tailors in Savile Row to this day, Henry Poole, which is still going, when they make their liveries for Buckingham Palace, they do everything by hand. Very much painstaking labor, but they feel it sits better, and actually only goes away from the point a little bit, but just to give you the scale of these things and the workmanship that goes into it, they are just now giving new uniform to the carriage footman to Buckingham Palace. It's the first time they've been replaced since 1879. And of course, if you watch any of these events, they wear them a lot. And so that's quite interesting. But yes, I can't say for certain. I haven't been able to study this enough as I'd like to before we had to put it on exhibition, whether it was machine stitched, but the gold work certainly would all be done by hand. Yes. Yeah, very good question. So how do we store uniforms such as this or textiles such as this to keep them in such good shape? So what we have is, so we're kind of wonderful in that you'd normally have your costume storage. It's separate from everything else. And you'd use acid-free boxes and acid-free tissue to store things. And you'd be very careful. We ideally lay them all flat so there's not undue stress on the garments. That's not always possible with spatial considerations in museums and historic homes. But we actually have our whole textile collection is stored within the original cedar closet of Anderson House, which cedar closet is a misnomer. It's a room, and everything is cedar lined. We have the old hooks that were used for whatever they were used for. They're all still there, brass hooks, some of the brass gas lamps, the fittings are still there. But yeah, so it's in a giant room of cedar, and that's where we keep all of the costume. And so some of it is kept in the same room it would have been kept in originally by the Andersons. So we've kind of got an extra layer of protection. But yes, it's something like that would be in a very, very long garment box that has to be carried by 2 people, just based on the size of it. But yes, we have dozens of like the liveries for the footmen that worked here. Yeah. Anything else in person? Anything on Zoom? Oh, one more question. Yes. So box spur, so where's that coming from? What's the naming there and how did they work? I don't quite know where the term box spur came from. I don't know if it's because, so what you get with the typical box spur arrangement, you have your Wellington boot, riding boot of leather, and then in the heel, you would have a small little catch effectively. That would be a little door, but then when you pushed the spur in, it would push through that door and go in and fit in. So you're not actually having to attach it with a textile like a cloth or anything like that. It's not getting it's not a buckle that's attaching it round like we think of so much with riding boots and things like that. It's actually just kind of clicking in. It's quite a neat little function. They have enough hooks and eyes to do up as they're getting ready, then so that kind of saves a bit of time. But yes, questions from Zoom, Andrew? Good question. Is there any significance with the plants? So they are reminiscent of oak leaves, which the British love. And certainly this uniform is very much drawing inspiration from the UK armed forces and civilian services that would wear such uniform. And they very much like oak leaf patterns on as kind of the badge, the kind of higher status kind of lace work. And if you pick up some of the books I've got, you get all sorts of different types of lace that was reserved for different purposes, different regiments, things like that. Some of that still holds true, but certainly an oak leaf pattern, and it's reminiscent of that, but it's not quite that. I'm not quite sure exactly what it is. Certainly if I got the right book, which I'm still working on, then maybe it would list that exact pattern, because they were very fastidious about all of these things. Oh, so So I guess I'll answer that two ways. So do diplomats wear anything like this today in the United States? Foreign, probably, but I don't know if any US diplomats would wear anything like this. And actually, I had a discussion with my wife the other day about Obama when he wore his white tie, tails, and whatnot when Her Majesty the Queen, Elizabeth II, came a couple of years ago. I don't think it's typically the case. Yeah, it's probably not the case at all, but I can't say for certain because I feel like probably someone from the State Department is watching. And of course, this is DC. There's a lot of folks like that. But I would say no. I would say no. Oh, you have a question, sir?
Yes, I don't understand. That's the company. That's some. They make a dress for this kind of thing. But a royal body, the Tsar, things and so, but clients or medical things.
Yes.
What's the difference?
Oh, in terms of the warrant or in terms of, so what?
The difference in the deal, not in the book. What's the difference in the deal? This company is the royal and this American company.
Oh, what in terms of what they were wearing, or so Davies and Son makes suits as well, like make civilian dress, make civilian suits. So it's probably more likely that they were wearing the American presidents that bought from Davies and Son were probably buying their suiting, maybe wearing tuxedos, things like that. It's probably what they ordered. Yeah. Did you have something? Okay. All right. Well, I think, do you want me to sign off? Yes. Well, thank you everyone for joining me today. And do check out our YouTube page. Come to Anderson House. It's lovely. And don't forget, we've got our wonderful exhibit, Affairs of State, that runs through the end of this year, December 31st. Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon.